Hi, everybody. I hope you had a good weekend. Um, I'm Reverend Dr. Laura Hunt, and today I am going to talk about forgiveness. Now, I spent a long time, both in growing up before I became a Christian and in the church, misunderstanding forgiveness and what it meant and what it was. I was taught early on in my life that forgiveness basically meant pretending that the other person didn't actually do the things they did do. That it meant going on with our relationship as though nothing happened. That was what I thought forgiveness was. And of course, there are times when we ought to just shrug off something annoying that another person did, understand that it's part of their humanity, and hope that they will make room for our humanity as well when we do things that annoy them, and then move forward in the relationship without necessarily ever mentioning the issue to the other person. But I no longer believe that that is forgiveness. That's grace. What I'm sharing today about forgiveness comes partly from the work of Lewis Smedes and partly from the work of Brene Brown. I'm also going to mention Gary Chapman, and partly from my own experience trying to live up to the Bible's expectations, the Bible's call for us to forgive. I read Lewis Smedes' book called The Art of Forgiving, and it was one of those books where some passages I read and thought, oh, yes, I wish someone had told me this when I was in my 20s. This is exactly what we need to be saying about forgiveness. And then other parts I read and thought, oh, I'm not really sure that that's correct, and it definitely doesn't match up with what I understand to be forgiveness. But he talks about forgiveness having 3 steps, and I think these are really helpful. The 3 steps that he suggests regarding forgiveness is that first of all, we rediscover the humanity of the person who hurt us. Second, we surrender our right to get even. And third, we begin to wish the person well. Now, notice that these are all things that we do inside of ourselves. This is not about reaching out to the other person. This is simply about, I have a friend who calls it keeping our side of the street clean. That's what this is about. So the first step then is to rediscover the humanity of the person who hurt us. It's so tempting when somebody has sinned against us to dismiss that person, to wave our hands and say, oh, they're just monsters, to relegate them to some non-human category in which they are completely evil. They're one of the bad guys, and we don't ever want anything to do with them again because they have clearly revealed that they belong in this other category that doesn't have anything to do with all of the categories like human beings, like Christians, like members of my church, like members of my family, to which we belong. Now, we do have to be honest about what it is they have done and the damage it has done to us or to the community or to various relationships. And we can't rush this part. God is a God of truth. So forgiveness can't be pretending that what happened didn't happen. Part of forgiveness is, in fact, telling the truth about what happened. And we have to be careful and not allow people to tell us that we are the ones causing division if we are simply speaking the truth about what happened to us. God forgives us, of course, but the very act of God forgiving us assumes that God knows exactly what we did, why we did it, and the destruction it caused. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any reason for forgiveness. And we have to be similarly honest about what happened and the effects of what happened on us. Smedes divides this into 5 steps. He says we take these feelings and we appropriate them. We acknowledge that we have these feelings. We name what these feelings are. Maybe we feel pain. Maybe we feel betrayal. There might be a whole other list of names that we can come up with to describe exactly what it is we're feeling. We evaluate it. Is our response relative to what happened reasonable? And if it isn't, is there some ancient, older hurt that has been triggered by this thing that happened, and we're really reacting to that older pain rather than this fresh example of it? And then at the end of all of that, and that can take hours, it can take days, it can take months, maybe even years. At the end of all of that, we come to the point where we say, okay, I know what I'm feeling. Now, what am I going to do with that? We take responsibility for the pain that's now living inside of us, for the feelings, the consequences of what has been done to us. I don't know about you, but if you're like me, when somebody hurts me, what I really want to do is rewind the tape and make it so they don't do that to me. I don't want this thing to have happened. And you can see that this process of being honest about how we feel is in part about moving us from this initial shock that this thing happened and the wishing and the desire that it wouldn't have happened, to an acceptance of the fact that it did happen and it has consequences. And these consequences are how I now feel about this other person. But once we've absorbed this blow, when we're ready, forgiveness means moving from seeing the person or the people who did this to us as monsters to seeing them as human. But it is also true that they are humans who have it in them to behave in this particular way. That means perhaps changing our image of them. Sometimes that's a really important step, where we have this image of this person and we think that they are something different than what they actually are. And so part of honesty and the first step of forgiveness is absorbing the reality of what they did, but also then moving from seeing the person as a dirty, rotten cheater, where their whole identity is narrowed down to what they did to me, to seeing them as a person who sometimes cheats. Cheating is not the whole of who the person is. They are, in fact, a child of God, a human being, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and beloved by God. But they're not always good. People say when someone tells you who they are, believe them. You now have more information about the kind of person they are. They are a person who sometimes cheats. And forgiving doesn't mean pretending that it isn't so. And this is related to time as well. Right now, they're a person who sometimes cheats. That may change. And if that happens, there might be possibilities in the future for a different kind of relationship. Maybe not with you, maybe with other people. There is hope for them, however. None of that erases the consequences of what they've done today to you, but neither do you or I have the power or the authority to banish them completely from humanity, to demote them from among even possibly those who are saved. Certainly God's love reaches out to them just as it does to us. So that's the first step, moving from the narrow focus where all we can see about this person is this thing they did to us, to stepping back a little bit and getting a wider view and recognizing that, like every other human being, they do things that are good, they do things that are evil, they do things that hurt other people, and that's what happened in this case. They are, however, in fact, human. The second step is to surrender our right to get even. We acknowledge that they really did do something bad to us, and therefore, in a sense, they owe us something. We were operating with them with this idea that we were going to have a certain kind of relationship. There may have been unspoken assumptions, unspoken agreements. In a marriage, they might even be spoken agreements about how we were going to behave one towards another. And if that trust is broken, then they have stolen from us the relationship that we had hoped and wanted and expected. So it's a debt. But what we say when we forgive is that we are not going to demand repayment for that debt. In other words, vengeance. We are not going to get revenge. I like the NIV translation of Matthew 6:12. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. This is a debt that we are releasing. This is why we can only forgive people who have wounded us, who owe us something. I can't forgive someone who's wounded someone else, only people who have wounded me, unless in wounding someone else, I've gotten wounded in the process. There may be a piece for me to forgive in that. But in general, we forgive people who have harmed us. And this forgiveness, this releasing of the debt they owe us is only the debt they owe to us. If they've broken the law, they owe a larger debt to society, and the demands of justice still stand. Human society may need protection against someone who sometimes chooses to do whatever things they have done. The church may rightly need to reevaluate that person's position and authority within the body of Christ. What we do when we forgive, we don't restore any of that. We simply release our own private debt, and we accept the fact that we are not going to require them to pay us back in any way for what they've done. The third thing we do is we wish them well. Now, I have a version of this that I use when I'm driving. When I'm driving and somebody cuts me off, or usually I get mad when somebody scares me. If somebody near me drives in a way that suddenly scares me, that's when the adrenaline just rushes up. And one of the things I sometimes remember to do is to look at that person and in my heart pray, Lord, bless them real good. And sometimes I say it through gritted teeth. And it's a little bit like what I've heard the Southern expression about, what is that Southern expression? Bless you, honey, or anyway, you probably know what it is better than I do. What I'm doing when I say, Lord, bless them real good, is I'm doing two things. I'm releasing some of how I feel. I'm letting God know how annoyed I am with this person. And I know, and God knows, that what I think they ought to be blessed with is some way of coming to their senses to realize how, what a mistake they made in their driving, and to wake up and have some experience that causes them to drive better. That's what I think God should bless them with. But the other piece of that, in that moment, is it's also a prayer that reminds me that I don't know what's going on in that person's life. I don't know if this is a person who's panicking because they're driving someone to the emergency room. I don't know if there are real reasons behind, the real valid, important reasons behind this little piece of their life that I have just witnessed. And so I am trusting God to bless them in the way that God knows they need to be blessed. So I am, and this is just getting cut off when you're driving. It's just such a little thing, but it's a really good example, I think, of the larger, longer process that we go through when we forgive someone for more serious sins against us. Because in that prayer, I am both releasing any desire for vengeance, and I'm also wishing them well from God's perspective, because I don't know what is good for them from mine. Now, this does not necessarily mean reconciliation. If we think about the parable of the prodigal son, where the son took his share of the inheritance and went into a far land and spent it all and ended up destitute, when he comes back and asks for forgiveness, The Father is so ready to forgive him that we can tell that the Father has done the work ahead of time. He has already worked through whatever feelings he might have had about his son, and it's a story, but still within the story world, he has already worked through whatever feelings he might have had about what his son did. He has already surrendered his right to get even. He already wishes good things for his son. However, notice that he didn't go to the far land searching for his son to bring him back to restore the relationship. It's only when his son comes back that he welcomes him. The relationship isn't restored until the son comes to his senses, apologizes, and accepts the reasonable consequences for his actions, which the father decides not to enforce, which is within his rights. This sort of leads us to apologies, and I'm going to make a short detour here to talk about apologies. Gary Chapman has a book called The 5 Languages of Apology, and this kind of reunion, this kind of restoration of relationship requires at a minimum some sort of apology. A thorough apology, Gary Chapman suggests, includes 5 things: an expression of regret, accepting responsibility for what you did, making restitution. Sometimes that might just mean reaffirming your love for that person, but sometimes it might mean paying back the vase you broke, or expressing how important this relationship is to you. Genuinely repenting. That means, okay, I'm not going to behave this way anymore, and here's what I'm going to do to not behave that way. And then simply requesting forgiveness. Would you please forgive me? Saying those words. Now, the most important thing in the context of forgiveness, though, that I want to say about apologies is that apologizing doesn't entitle you to forgiveness. When we are the ones who have done wrong, we apologize because when we are wrong, we should own it. And we should be willing to accept the consequences of what we've done. And we want to create a place of hope for a renewal of the relationship. But that hope may not be fulfilled immediately. Because when there has been a serious breakdown, which is the kind of thing we're talking about here, when there's been a serious breakdown in a relationship, the relationship doesn't just simply go back to the level of intimacy that it had before the offense. We both take a few steps back. Trust needs to be slowly rebuilt, and only the offended party gets to decide whether, when, and how fast to restore that relationship. Now, this is because, again, forgiveness is about telling the truth. The person who was sinned against deserves the space to heal, and healing is different than forgiving. I can wish you well if you have sinned against me, but still decide, based on the truth that I now know about you, that you are not someone I want a close relationship with. For me, this has to do with space, leaving some space around people where they have grace to be imperfect people, and then determining, based on my own need for space and the grace I want to offer to myself, how close or far away I need to stand. Now, that takes into account my own imperfections as well. There are simply things that I don't react to well in this world. And in the process of working on those, and in the process of becoming a better person in those areas, and in the process of healing old wounds that will allow me to be stronger and better in those areas, there may be situations I want to avoid. As an introvert, for example, when I can, I need to try to avoid overextending myself with people time, because I'm just not a really great person to be around if I insist that I should show up at every event that I'm invited to. It's not wise for me to do that. And that really has more to do with me than it has to do with anybody else. And so in these relationships, we may make some decisions about where we are able to function and where we need to take a step back while preserving the humanity of the other person, simply also giving ourselves grace. Now, I know that this doesn't sound like the kind of forgiveness that's often been preached in our churches, but the passage that I often think of in some of these situations comes at the end of John chapter 8. Jesus has been talking to his opposition, and notice that he's not afraid in this exchange, if you read it, to speak the truth to them, but ultimately at the end they want to stone him. And his response is not to stay there and continue to talk with them and continue to be in relationship with them in that moment, but rather he hid and left the temple. Now, of course, his opponents thought they were right. They were obeying God. They were keeping their religion pure from heretics and madmen. But Jesus' example here, where people want to hurt him and he walks away, that, it seems to me, frees me and frees you to walk away as well. If we are in a situation where the other person, whether intentionally or not, whether out of good motives that they think are good and holy and pure or not, is constantly hurting us. Now, the one time that Jesus didn't walk away, of course, was at the crucifixion. But that connects back to what we said last week about suffering. We may choose to stay in a relationship or to stay in a location, to keep a membership in a group when suffering is coming to us as opposition to life-giving work that we are doing in that relationship or in that space. But only we ourselves, only the person in that ministry can decide when to persevere and when to walk away. Apologies and forgiveness are about keeping our side of the street clean. As a Wesleyan, I see God in the Bible giving humanity choices and respecting our individuality. Similarly, apologies and forgiveness are not tools to restore a relationship. They are what we need to do to keep our side of the street clean. Restored relationships only happen if both people are willing and able to meet in the middle. But relationships are like doors in adjoining rooms in a motel. And when you open your side of the door and the other door is closed, you might knock, but you need to respect someone else's privacy. And they need to respect yours. Thank you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.